We are going to talk about a journey that should have been the greatest human triumph, but instead became one of our most profound, agonizing, and almost unbelievable failures. I want you to forget what you think you know about ancient migrations. Forget the stoic explorers, the great hunters marching fearlessly into the unknown. That's the Hollywood version. We are going to look at the human cost of a migration, the real, sticky, agonizing terror of walking toward a promise that turns out to be a betrayal. We are talking about a time when our species stood on the edge of the world, ready to conquer the final continent, the Americas. Think about what defined us humans, for the first 100,000 years of our existence. It wasn't our strength, it was our stamina. We are the ultimate persistence hunters. We are built to walk, built to endure, built to simply put one foot in front of the other until the landscape gives way. Movement is our survival mechanism. Our history, your DNA, is defined by relentless forward momentum. But what happens when the very thing that defines you, the ability to walk, the imperative to move, becomes the anchor dragging you down? What happens when the path ahead isn't just difficult, but actively, malevolently structured to exhaust you into oblivion? This is the story of the Ice Road, a passage that should have been the birthplace of civilizations, but which became a cemetery built step by weary step. We are looking at the final push, the moment when groups of people, genetically and socially primed for North America, gathered on the desolate plains of Bering. This was the land bridge, now submerged beneath the Bering Strait, connecting Siberia to Alaska. For centuries, perhaps millennia, they had successfully eked out an existence in the deep Arctic, masterfully hunting woolly mammoths living on the margins of the ice. But those margins were getting tighter. The world was changing, and in their collective memory, there was always the rumor, the legend, or perhaps the recent scouting report. There is a way south. There is a land beyond the great ice. Imagine the scene. It's not a single tribe, but likely many small kin groups, extended families, grandparents, parents, children, perhaps a few unrelated stragglers bound together by mutual desperation. They weren't setting off on a glorious expedition. They were refugees, walking away from shrinking resources and toward an unimaginable hope. You see them dressed in heavy layered hides, bulky and restrictive, stinking of smoke and stale sweat. Every single possession that defines their survival is on their back, or perhaps lashed precariously to a primitive sledge hauled by a few exhausted dogs, if they were lucky enough to still have dogs. The air itself is a weapon. It's not just cold, it's an atmosphere of constant, bone-searing dampness, where every breath is a shallow negotiation with frostbite. And then the path opens. For tens of thousands of years, two colossal masses of ice, the Laurentide ice sheet to the east and the Cordilleran ice sheet to the west, had merged, sealing off North America like a fortress. But geological forces, subtle warming trends, and the colossal physics of melting ice began to act. A seam appeared. Not a clean, easy highway, but a growing crack, a funnel known to history as the ice-free corridor. To them, standing on the edge of that frozen world, it looked like freedom. It looked like the end of the line. It was the only direction left to walk. We tend to look at the ice-free corridor on a map and think of it as a line, a route, but you have to experience it, even mentally, as a terrain of pure, hostile inconvenience. This corridor wasn't just a path, it was the ultimate calorie thief. The theories, grounded in paleobotany and geology, paint a devastating picture. When that corridor first widened enough to walk through, it was not yet a welcoming tundra. It was a zone of sheer geological instability. Think about two massive ice sheets, miles thick, rubbing against each other and then pulling apart. What is left behind? sterile, churned up earth, massive lakes of meltwater that constantly shifted, turning the ground into dangerous energy-sapping glacial mud. And most crucially, for the people walking, a terrifying absence of life. The corridor lacked the most basic necessities required for human migration: fuel and food. Trees, non-existent or too sparse to rely on for consistent fires, and fire in that environment wasn't a luxury. It was the mechanism that kept the blood flowing and the clothing dry. Game? The large migratory animals they relied on, the bison, the caribou, knew this terrain was a nutritional dead zone. They stayed where the grazing was reliable, far to the east or west, near the established ice margins. These families, our ancestors, walked into a 500-mile-long glacial treadmill. Every step was a decision to expend calories they couldn't replace. Every gust of wind was sucking the warmth from a child's cheek. Every river crossing was a high-stakes gamble with hypothermia. They were walking into a vacuum, a place where their greatest skill, endurance, was systematically worn down by the sheer, grinding friction of the environment. We, historians and archaeologists, can track successful migrations by finding their campsites, their tools, their waste piles. We find the evidence of life sustained. But what if the evidence we find is only the ghost of a successful push? What about the groups that failed? Imagine the slow, terrible realization dawning on the leader, the father, the uncle, the matriarch. They keep walking, insisting on the forward motion because the idea of retreating back into the known scarcity is unthinkable. But the pace slows. The children, already weakened, start to cry, not from fear, but from the pain of total exhaustion. The adults start leaving precious cargo behind, not for convenience, but because they physically cannot lift the pack anymore. The cold wasn't the immediate killer. Starvation wasn't the immediate killer. The killer was the distance, coupled with the barrenness. The killer was the failure of the environment to sustain the very act of walking. You walk until you can no longer raise your foot. You stop. And that is when the true history begins to catch up with you. That is when the most human instinct to move, to survive, to reach that next valley simply runs out of fuel. They didn't die quickly or dramatically. They simply ground to a halt. They had crossed the land bridge. They had found the mythical path south. They were closer to the eventual flowering of new human civilization than any people before them. But they stopped, and they waited, and they froze right there, caught between two colossal walls of ice. They became the lost generation, the human cost of the corridor. And the question that haunts us now is not where they went, but what they saw in those final, desperate moments when they realized that the ultimate human superpower, movement, had been rendered tragically, irrevocably useless. The bodies were too far north. The resources were too scarce. The ice was too unforgiving. And the only thing left for them to do was wait for the cold to finish the job that the lack of food began. And the terrible reality is, they weren't alone in the ice. Others were coming right behind them, and they too were walking toward the great silence. And here we stand, you and I, staring at the sheer scale of the late Pleistocene, trying to grasp the mind of a person who lived 20,000 years ago. We have the luxury of satellite images, carbon dating, and hindsight. They had nothing but the relentless, howling wind. When we talk about this migration, about the people who crossed Beringia, that land bridge, that mythical road connecting two worlds, we often focus on the success stories. We talk about the people who made it. But historical consensus, grounded in ice core data and hard archaeology, paints a much darker picture for this specific group. We have to understand the timeline. This wasn't a quick sprint across a field. This was a generational trek across a world actively trying to reset itself. The land bridge itself was only fully possible at specific times, dictated by the enormous cyclical expansion and retreat of the ice sheets. By the time this specific group of travelers decided to push south, the ice had started to peel back just enough. The problem? They moved too fast for the Earth. Imagine those colossal ice sheets, the Laurentides stretching across the eastern continent and the Cordilleran dominating the west. For thousands of years, they were kissing cousins, locked together in an impenetrable embrace that sealed off the lower continent. But around 15,000 years ago, maybe a little later, the warming pulse caused a seam to open. A gap, sometimes barely 10 miles wide, stretching hundreds upon hundreds of miles south, a supposed highway to paradise. This was the Ice-Free Corridor, IFC, and it was less a corridor and more a geological scar. Academics debate hotly about whether the first true Americans, the people who built the eventual foundations of North and South America, came this way. Many now believe the earliest successful migrants took the coastal route, hugging the Pacific edge, traveling mostly by boat, and avoiding the continental interior entirely. But these people, the ones we are watching freeze right now, they committed to the interior. They walked the Great Seam, and if they weren't the first, they were certainly the most tragically confident follow-up act in human history. They had pushed past Beringia, perhaps following herds of animals that sensed the path opening up. They saw the ice receding, revealing exposed tundra, massive, brutal hills of rock pulverized by the weight of mile-thick ice. And they thought, we are winning. They thought the gods were finally guiding them. What they didn't realize is that even though the ice had separated, the corridor itself was, ecologically speaking, dead. Picture yourself there, in the narrowest part of the passage. Look up. You are standing between two colossal, vertical walls of blue ice, probably a mile or two high. The sun barely reaches the floor. The temperature, even in summer, is 0 or below. Glacial meltwater, freezing cold and rushing like a freight train, would have carved deep, treacherous chasms and rivers through the ground they walked on. And perhaps the most terrifying reality of all, the food hadn't arrived yet. Archaeology tells us that when the ice-free corridor first opened, it was a biological desert. Yes, the megafauna, the woolly mammoths, the giant bison were alive elsewhere, but they hadn't yet migrated into this new, sterile territory. The plant life, the grasses, the small shrubs that would feed the herds and keep the humans going, they take time to root, to flourish, to colonize. We are talking about a time frame of hundreds, perhaps even 1,000 years, between the physical opening of the path and the arrival of a viable ecosystem. These families walked in during the sterile gap. They carried everything they could, perhaps dried meat, tools, fire-starting kits, their history etched onto antler or bone. But every day that passed was a net loss. There was nothing to hunt, nothing to gather, maybe the odd, desperate scavenging of lichen or moss clinging to rock. This wasn't an acute disaster, like a sudden blizzard or a flood. This was the slow, crushing realization that the earth itself had engineered a siege they could not win. They couldn't go back. The way they came was sealed by renewed cold or collapsing passes. They couldn't go forward. The southern mouth of the corridor hadn't fully opened, or the resource depletion had become too severe long before they reached the end. They were trapped in a funnel of ice, and their great human superpower, that restless, unending need to move toward better resources, was what killed them. Think about the sound. The silence, broken only by the deafening crack of a glacier shifting position hundreds of feet above their heads, or the constant high-pitched scream of the wind tearing through the narrow canyon. We can track this in the archaeological record, though the direct human evidence is maddeningly sparse, scattered, and contested, but the ecological data is indisputable. When the people entered, the sustenance wasn't there, so they stopped. They dug shallow shelters into the frozen earth. They tried to fish the frigid waters that rushed past, maybe catching small, desperate trout. They looked at their children, small bundles wrapped tightly in increasingly frayed hides, and realized the truth. The fuel for the fire of life was gone. Imagine the desperation of the elders, the weight of their failure. They had promised the young ones freedom, warmth, plains teeming with buffalo. Instead, they delivered them to a freezer designed by geological forces far beyond their understanding. And this is where the tragedy compounds. When starvation begins, the social structure breaks down, not violently, but tragically slowly. Who gets the last mouthful of dried berry? Who sacrifices their own warmth so the baby might survive the night? The strongest are needed to hunt, but there is nothing to hunt. The frailest, the babies, and the very old become ghosts first. They weren't killed by an enemy tribe or a volcanic eruption. They were starved by a waiting geography. And as the cold deepened, as the meager, finite resources they carried ran out, they had to start making choices. Choices that haunt us even now, thousands of years later, when we stare at the geological maps. They saw the end coming. They had exhausted the land, and the land was exhausting them. But the most terrifying part of their final weeks was not the sight of their own dwindling strength. It was the knowledge that they had failed to warn the others. Remember, they weren't alone in the ice. Behind them, hundreds of miles to the north, more families, more tribes, fueled by the same desperate hope and the same ancient urge to move south, were entering the corridor. They were walking the exact same path, and they were about to encounter the same silent, deadly ambush that had consumed the pioneers. An ambush they would never see until their own feet were frozen solid to the ground. The ice had claimed the first wave, and it was patiently waiting for the second. And that second wave, unlike the first, had been delayed just long enough to see something truly horrifying. They had begun to stumble across the wreckage of the people who went ahead. And you realize then, the corridor wasn't just a physical trap. It became a graveyard lined with warnings no one could interpret until it was too late. The road south was now paved with the silent evidence of failure, and those following had no choice but to step over the frozen bodies of their ancestors, hoping, against all evidence, that their own journey would somehow be different. The sight of the dead is a horror beyond comprehension, but the silence of those bodies is even worse. Think about it. You're walking the most desperate road on earth, clinging to the smallest shred of hope, and then you stumble across the perfectly preserved evidence that hope is a lie. They weren't just skeletons. They were frozen monuments to failure. People you might have known, perhaps distant cousins or members of the clan that left just weeks before you, now locked in poses of unimaginable agony. A father still clutching a broken spear. A woman whose face is turned toward the sky, eyes wide, seeing nothing but the relentless gray of the glacial ceiling. And you realize, with a cold dread that has nothing to do with the wind chill, that you cannot stop. You can't perform rites. You cannot dig a grave in the glacial till and the permafrost. You can't even afford the emotional energy to mourn. You must step over them. You must force your own children to step over the remnants of the people who were supposed to lead the way. The road south was now marked by death, serving as morbid mile markers that screamed, "Turn back! It's not worth it!" But we couldn't turn back. The impulse to move forward was rooted so deep, tens of thousands of years deep, that it outweighed all immediate evidence. Turning back meant admitting that everything, the journey, the suffering, the loss of the loved ones who hadn't survived the initial traverse through the Bering land bridge, had been for nothing. We had bought into the greatest geographical deception in history. When academics talk about the ice-free corridor, they often focus on the when, the dates it was physically passable. But those dates missed the human reality of what it was. This wasn't a lush, teeming valley. It was the crack between two colossal forces. The Laurentide ice sheet to the east, thicker and broader than the Rocky Mountains, and the Cordilleran ice sheet to the west. We weren't walking through Canada. We were walking through a sterile, newly scraped gap in the world. Imagine walking for weeks and weeks through a landscape that feels like the planet was born yesterday. There are no mature forests. There is no ancient soil packed with nutrients. There are no established herds of mammoth. No massive bison ready for the taking. This corridor had only recently become physically passable, perhaps 13,000 to 14,000 years ago, according to the latest consensus. But crucially, it wasn't ecologically viable. The ground beneath our feet was just rock and meltwater slush. The air was a constant, vicious windstorm, funneled and accelerated between the ice walls, rising thousands of feet on either side. We were trying to survive on the biological equivalent of an empty highway. We were walking on pure potential, and potential doesn't feed a starving child. This is where the true horror sets in, the slow, grinding starvation, amplified by the cold. To maintain body heat in these sub-Arctic conditions, you need massive amounts of calories, specifically fat. Every mile we walked consumed the reserves meant to keep us alive. Every moment spent chipping away at a frozen carcass of a muskox or a desperate attempt to net fish in a partially frozen river cost more energy than it returned. It became a caloric debt we could never repay, and the smallest wound became a death sentence. A blister on a heel rubbed raw by a stiff frozen boot led to infection. Infection led to fever. Fever in that climate led to delirium and a rapid slide into hypothermia. You couldn't stop the march to care for the sick for long. To stop was to freeze the entire group in place. So, you had families faced with decisions that still haunt the archaeological record. Do we slow down and risk the whole tribe for one feverish cousin? Or do we leave them a tiny cache of dried meat, knowing it's not enough, and pray for a mercy that this landscape refused to grant? The evidence we find is sobering. We see tools shattered, not from use, but from desperation, broken down to get every last shard of usable bone marrow. We see signs of intense scavenging, bones gnawed clean by human hands long after the animals were gone. And then there's the silence of the children. They stop crying. They just get heavy. They become anchors of bone and muscle wrapped in threadbare hides, requiring more energy than the parents possess to carry. We kept looking south, convinced that the environment would eventually break. We thought the ice walls must surely recede. The green fields must be just one more week away. That hope, that blind inherited trust in the Earth's generosity, was perhaps the greatest mistake. Because while we were focused on what lay ahead, we completely missed the lethal truth of what was happening behind us. The conditions weren't just harsh, they were dynamically changing. The very geography that allowed the corridor to open, the warming trend that melted the joining ice sheets, was also unstable. The margins of the Cordilleran and Laurentide were not static. They were fluid, massive rivers of ice responding to subtle shifts in temperature and snowfall. And while we were trudging deeper and deeper into the environmental sterility, sacrificing our sick, stepping over the corpses of our pioneers, the two great ice sheets began to shift. Not dramatically, not instantly, but with the slow, crushing inevitability of geological time. The corridor wasn't staying open. It was slowly, silently closing. We had walked into the trap, past the point of no return, and we wouldn't realize we were completely cut off from the north, from the only place we knew, until the moment we tried to push south, only to find ourselves staring at a solid, impassable wall of ice that hadn't been there just months before. We were caught in the middle. The sterile north was blocked, and the fertile south remained maddeningly out of reach. We had traded the slow death of starvation for the rapid, freezing death of entrapment. And for the next few thousand years, the only evidence that humanity ever walked this path would be the frozen remnants of families huddled together, waiting for the winter that never ended. But the final agonizing stage of this journey wasn't just physical entrapment. It was the realization that the very geography we relied upon to move had begun to fail us in the most catastrophic way imaginable. We didn't just walk into a geographical trap. We walked into a time warp, a hostile zone designed specifically to negate everything we knew about surviving as humans. Think about your ancestors, our ancestors. They were the greatest persistence hunters the world had ever known. They understood the landscape, they followed the herds, they knew which berries would kill you and which would save you. They carried in their genetic memory tens of thousands of years of perfect, rigorous environmental knowledge. And then we stepped onto this 1,500-mile-long scar between the ice sheets, and all that knowledge became utterly useless. The moment those ice walls closed behind us, they weren't just sealing us off. They were creating an entirely new ecological zone, a cold, geological horror show that the rest of the planet hadn't experienced. It wasn't the North. It wasn't the South. It was the corridor. For those academics who study this time, the ones who argue endlessly about when the first human foot touched the lower continent, this geography is the ultimate choke point. You see, for a long time, the dominant theory was called Clovis first. They saw the distinctive, beautiful Clovis points appearing across North America around 13,500 years ago, and they assumed those were the pioneers, the people who waited for the corridor to open, then walked south. It was a beautiful, simple story. But our tragedy, the tragedy of us trapped here, is one of the reasons that theory began to crumble. Archaeologists started finding scattered, maddening proof. Sites far south, in places like Monteverde, Chile, or deep in Texas, dated to 14,000, 15,000, even 16,000 years ago. The pre-Clovis people. Someone got south earlier, somehow, perhaps skirting the coast, before this inland route was even fully functional. Which means the people we are following, us, are not necessarily the first wave of explorers. We might be the second, the third, or even the last, rushing headlong into a path that had been open only fleetingly, believing the coast was too difficult or already occupied. We were walking into the corridor, convinced we were pioneers, when in reality we were walking into the cleanup operation of a dying ice age. We believed we were following the megafauna. We expected endless grazing land, teeming with animals funneled by the ice, but imagine the reality. The corridor was less a verdant valley and more a cold, windswept desert. The ground was composed of glacial till, gravel, dust, rock flour, constantly churned and frozen. The ice sheets weren't static, towering walls of crystal. They were active, groaning beasts. On your right, the vast Laurentide sheet stretched east across half the continent. On your left, the rugged Cordilleran ice cap clung to the mountains. And between them, a river of freezing wind funneled at high velocity. If you've ever been truly cold, not just shivering cold, but the kind of cold that seeps into your bones and stays there until the sun comes up, multiply that by 10, and then make it the air you breathe for 6 solid months. We were constantly wet from the condensation of the ice walls, yet we had no fresh water to drink because everything was locked solid. We couldn't build fires effectively. Think about the basic necessity of survival. Fuel. Where did we find wood? In this sterile, periglacial environment, trees were almost non-existent, clinging only to isolated micropockets far off the main path. We were reduced to burning dried grasses, old bone fat, or even the frozen hides of our discarded winter clothes just to keep a small spark alive, a spark often immediately extinguished by the relentless, howling wind. We were hunters, yes. We followed the migratory herds of bison, and perhaps the odd mammoth or mastodon that wandered down from the north. But the herds here were not the easy targets we expected. They were stressed, moving fast, and they too were fighting for the same sparse bitter grasses we needed. This wasn't about a shortage of food. It was about a catastrophic failure of the ecosystem to sustain continuous movement. The archaeological record eventually speaks to this desperation, though not in grand monuments or beautiful pottery. It speaks in discarded tools, in the scatter patterns of butchery sites, and most tellingly, in the lack of complex habitation. When archaeologists find evidence in the corridor, it isn't evidence of settlement. It's evidence of transience, of people stopping just long enough to process a kill, terrified to linger. The toolkits found, crude scrapers, simple flakes, suggest the people were running too fast to manufacture proper, specialized gear. They were living off the bare necessities, prioritizing speed over preparation. We traded comfort and security for velocity. We told ourselves, just keep walking south. The fertile plains are just beyond the next bend in the ice. But the next bend never brought the plains. It brought more gravel, more wind, and the terrifying slow realization that the Cordilleran and Laurentide masses were not receding together in a synchronized dance. They were breathing, they were expanding, and they were, at times, violently contracting. Imagine the sound of the world's largest objects moving. The ice sheets weren't silent walls. They were glaciers. They carved, they cracked, and they released torrents of cold, muddy, sediment-laden meltwater. Vast, unpredictable rivers that could erase an entire family camp in the middle of the night. You would wake up to the sound of thousands of tons of water rushing where dry land had been hours before. This wasn't navigable terrain. This was geological chaos. We had relied on our skill. We had relied on our tools. We had relied on the deep, ingrained confidence that humanity, given any challenge, would adapt. But the corridor broke adaptation. It demanded a specialization we hadn't evolved yet, a specialization for walking through an endless graveyard. The worst part of the entrapment, however, wasn't the physical cold, or the lack of food, or the fear of flash floods. It was the cultural decay that began to set in, slowly, inexorably, as the weeks bled into months, and the months promised only another year of this agonizing purgatory. The hunt that was once a source of communal pride and life became a brutal, zero-sum competition. When you cannot feed your children, when your cultural stories about the abundance of the Great Plains become cruel, pathetic jokes shouted into the wind, something fundamental breaks. You start making choices that violate every deeply held taboo. And out there, in that cold desert, when the last bison bones were cracked for marrow and the desperation reached its peak, we had to look at our neighbors, our kin, our own children, and decide what a life was worth when the geography itself had sentenced us all to death. The social contract, the thing that made us human, began to dissolve into the silence of the snow. The trail south was now just a path of frozen misery, and the evidence of what happened next, the ultimate horror, is still being interpreted by those who find our remnants trying to understand how a civilization could starve in the middle of an ice age. We need to talk about the ultimate horror. We've established the geography sentenced them, but we need to look at the receipts, the cold, clinical, heartbreaking evidence that proves exactly what happened when the social contract snapped. When archaeologists uncover sites that chronicle starvation on this scale, the slow, agonizing death of a large group of people trapped by ice, they aren't looking for perfect bodies or dignified ceremonies. They are looking for the breakage patterns. They are looking for the evidence that when the last remnants of bison were consumed, when the small animals like Arctic foxes and hares had been hunted into local extinction, and when every scrap of bark, root, and inedible leather had been boiled down to a flavorless pulp, the people turned inward. They look at human long bones, and they don't see the signs of natural decay or animal scavenging. They see what they call high-yield processing. This isn't a quick, desperate act of survival. It's the meticulous, methodical extraction of every single calorie possible. We have to be honest with ourselves. The cultural sophistication that defined them, the complex toolkits, the deep spiritual connection to the land, the detailed narratives they carried in their minds, all of that dissolved when the internal clock of survival hit zero. They cracked the human femurs and humeri, just as they cracked the bison bones, in specific, controlled ways to access the marrow. They boiled the spongy ends of the joints to render the fat. They used stone tools to scrape muscle tissue clean from the bone, leaving behind telltale marks that are undeniably the signature of preparation for consumption. This is how we know the truth. It wasn't just a few isolated instances of desperation. It was the adoption of an unspeakable practice out of necessity. It was the cruel math of survival, forcing them to choose between violating every deep taboo and watching their entire lineage vanish simultaneously. Can you imagine that moment? Being the person responsible for starting the process. Watching your neighbors, people you shared stories and warmth with, people whose children played with yours, become merely a source of necessary, life-extending fuel. That horror, etched into the bone fragments found millennia later, is the defining tragedy of this migration. They did not just starve, they were forced to cannibalize their identity. And while they were doing this, while they were fighting this internal war against their own humanity, the geography was slamming the final door shut. Remember, they were moving south, seeking warmth, seeking the open plains, seeking the life they had always known. But they were trapped in the high-latitude desert known as Beringia, the land bridge that connected continents. To their east lay the vast, immovable block of the Laurentide ice sheet, an expanse of frozen water the size of a continent, thousands of feet thick. To their west, the Cordilleran ice sheet towered, sprawling across the mountains and choking off the coastline. The crucial detail, the final geographic curse, is this. As the climate worsened, those two titans of ice began to merge. That famed ice-free corridor, the theoretical path between the sheets that history books sometimes talk about, was at best a hellish, temporary landscape of meltwater, gravel, and lethal flash floods. But during the absolute peak of the glaciation, when the desperation was highest, that corridor closed. The two ice masses coalesced, or at least created a bottleneck so narrow, so high, and so hostile that it became impassable. The Ice Age wasn't just cold. It was dynamic. The glaciers moved like slow-motion oceans, grinding the landscape down. And for our migrating families, they found themselves facing an insurmountable wall of white, stretching endlessly to the horizon. This realization must have been the ultimate psychological breaker. For a nomadic people, movement is safety. Movement is hope. If you can move, you can find resources. If you stop moving, you die. When they realized the ice walls had met, when the scouts came back, hollow-eyed, reporting that there was no way through, no way around, that the entire world ahead was frozen solid, that's when the clock stopped. They weren't just trapped by cold or by hunger. They were trapped by the sheer, unmoving mass of the planet's geology. They had nowhere to go. They couldn't push south because of the ice. They couldn't turn back north because that direction led only to the even more barren plains they had just fled. They couldn't stay put because the local environment was already utterly depleted. So, they became stationary in a world that demanded movement. Imagine the elders sitting in the biting wind, knowing the cultural memory of abundance was now a total lie. The decision-making process must have been agonizing. Do we expend the last ounces of energy trying to climb a wall of vertical ice, only to slip and fall? Do we wait here, conserving energy, watching the weakest die first until no one is left? The archaeological remnants from this era, from these precise bottleneck locations, don't show large, well-organized camps. They show scattered hearts, hastily abandoned tools, and evidence of short, furious attempts to crack through rock faces to find minerals or to dig into frozen soil for roots that weren't there. It's the signature of chaos and dispersal, the final desperate attempt of family units to break away from the larger failing group, hoping that a smaller, faster unit might somehow slip through the net. We see the evidence of this ultimate diaspora. We see the footprints, preserved briefly in layers of ancient silt, indicating erratic movements, circles, loops, backtracking, the confused wanderings of people who have lost their map, lost their purpose, and are relying solely on the animal impulse to take one more agonizing step toward nothing. This is the point where survival became truly conditional. The group could no longer support its weakest members. The social contract was fully revoked, and the only question left was who would be sacrificed to buy the group or the individual one more day of frozen, pointless existence, standing right at the lip of the impenetrable ice. The trail south was now truly over. They were standing at the base of a continent-sized tomb, staring into the blizzard, trying to decide which direction offered the quickest death. And then, history shows us, a few of them, driven by an instinct beyond reason, chose to test the impossible wall. We stand with them, right here on the edge of the deepest, whitest silence on earth. And you have to ask, why? Why test the impossible wall? The trail south was hell, yes, but at least it was a known hell. The decision to turn north, to push into the boundless frozen interior, that wasn't a tactical maneuver based on maps or resources. It was a psycho-spiritual decision. It was the moment the human spirit, stripped of all logical framework, decided that the only variable left to change was the direction of the suffering. They chose the unknown over the predictable, agonizing decline. And history shows us exactly where this critical, fatal turn occurred. Archaeology gives us what we call disposal caches. These aren't intentional storage spots for later use. They are evidence of profound desperation. The final inventory review, where survival dictated the abandonment of every non-critical ounce. Imagine you, right now, standing in a blizzard, realizing that the beautifully carved spear handle you spent 3 months perfecting, the one that represents your family legacy, is now simply too heavy. The bone knife, the spare hide, the talisman, they all hit the snow. The evidence is heartbreakingly clear. They ditched anything that required 2 hands to carry, anything that didn't directly translate into immediate warmth or immediate calories. What they kept, the barest essentials, tells us their calculation. They were calculating time in hours, not weeks. They were betting that the ice sheet was a thin temporary barrier, a brief, awful walk to a better hunting ground. They were catastrophically wrong. The deep ice sheet is not land. It is not terrain. It is a slow, grinding, geological machine that chews up life and renders space meaningless. When you are standing on a coastal plain, your brain has landmarks, the shape of a rock, the line of the distant horizon, the texture of the ground under your feet. This is how you orient yourself. When they stepped onto the true glacial ice, the permanent white nothing, they stepped into sensory deprivation. The sun, even if it was weak, reflected 90% back at them, causing snow blindness and erasing all visual contrast. The ground was just the floor of the sky. The horizon vanished. They were enveloped in a world of pure, featureless white, where the human brain rapidly loses the ability to determine up from down or even forward from backward. Think about the psychological toll on that small cohort. Maybe just a handful of families who decided to take the risk. You are walking, pushing against a wind that feels less like air and more like concrete dust. And you look back to see if your footprint is there, and sometimes it isn't. The wind has erased it instantly. There is no proof you have moved. There is no proof you are going anywhere. This is where the collective effort truly collapsed. We are no longer talking about a single group, but fragmented units operating on pure, terror-driven instinct. The energy required to simply melt enough snow for survival was prohibitive. Dehydration, paradoxically, becomes a rapid killer in an environment entirely made of water. Melting ice requires fuel, precious precious fuel, and that fuel must be carried. Now, we come to the coldest, cruelest detail of this entire tragedy. We see evidence preserved in the permafrost, not of quick, shared death, but of unequal deterioration. The archaeology points to small, makeshift shelters that weren't built for long-term survival. They were simply places to die less immediately. And within these small, frozen encampments, we find the signs of what happens when the social contract is not just revoked, but actively monetized. The elders, who once carried the stories and the knowledge, could no longer move. The children, whose bodies required disproportionate warmth and calories, became the greatest metabolic burden. And the most heartbreaking evidence is the abandonment of specific tools and items near certain bodies. We see the small, lightweight hunting tools, the gear of the able-bodied adult, gone. We see the heavy, warming cloaks made from rich furs also gone. But we see the bodies themselves often wearing only the lighter, thinner layers. What does this tell us? It tells us that when a person collapsed, unable to rise, their warmth and their tools immediately became assets for the few who still had the strength to walk. You don't have time for mourning, not in the -40 wind chill. You strip the warmth off the dying, you take their remaining fuel, and you walk on. It is not malice. It is physics expressed as brutality. It is the final, ultimate betrayal required to purchase another 4 hours of life. And those 4 hours brought them nothing but a further distance from safety. They pushed too far onto the ice shelf. They believed the lie that the deep interior offered respite. Instead, they found only the true, terrifying scale of the northern ice sheet, a featureless, grinding expanse that has no end, no shelter, and no mercy. The final resting places of these specific doomed pioneers are not large burial sites. They are just scattered individuals, where the bodies simply stopped walking, where the metabolic fire finally snuffed out, and the snow immediately began its gentle, eternal work of burial. We find one individual here, perhaps a day's march later, another one there. They weren't migrating together anymore. They were dying alone, convinced, perhaps until the very last moment, that the next step would bring them to the end of the white. But there was no end. There was only the realization, as the ice fog thickened and the wind screamed its final note, that they had not been walking toward a life. They had been walking deeper and deeper into a grave they themselves had volunteered for. They had used up their last resources. They had expended their last scraps of moral humanity. And now, deep within the terrifying embrace of the ice, cut off by storms from any possible path back to the coast, they realized the terrible finality of their mistake. They were completely, absolutely alone, standing right where the archaeological trail stops cold. And what happened next is not just a guess based on the weather. It is written in the very structure of the remaining bones, the chilling evidence of how their final, agonizing moment was spent. You want to know what the evidence says? It's far worse than a simple burial beneath the snow. The trail doesn't just stop because the people ran out of steam. It stops because at these final desperate camps, which weren't camps at all, but rather final resting places, you see the full, brutal archaeological record of complete human system failure. We're talking about the deep biological and moral collapse of a functioning society, reduced to its bare, starving components. Remember how we talked about them discarding anything non-essential? When they reached this absolute terminal point, they weren't discarding things anymore. They were consuming them. Not food, obviously. They were burning everything that contained even a whisper of energy. Researchers have sifted through the final ash pits, and what they tell us is chilling. These people weren't burning wood, because there was no wood. They were burning bone, leather stripped from non-essential bags, and, most terrifyingly, the structural fat of their own dead. If it could slow the inevitable chill for 5 more minutes, it went into the flame. You have to understand the level of cold we are discussing. We might romanticize the idea of explorers freezing stoically, but hypothermia combined with extreme caloric deficit warps the mind long before it stops the heart. The internal temperature drops and the brain starts to fail. Judgment goes first, then memory, then terrifyingly, empathy. This journey was meant to be a collective success. They traveled as families, as kin, bound by the fundamental ancient rules of mutual survival. But deep in the ice, when the stomach starts eating itself, that ancient contract shatters instantly. When survival means that the meager calories you consume directly reduce the chances of the person next to you surviving, what do? Who gets the last mouthful of boiled, pulverized boot leather? This is where the archaeological record becomes absolutely unforgiving. When academics study skeletal remains from prolonged starvation sites, they look for specific patterns of bone modification. We are talking about forensic evidence of extreme desperation, the processing of bones not for building tools, but for accessing every trace of marrow, every nutrient. They were grinding down the non-structural porous ends of large bones, the ribs, the vertebrae, to extract the oils and minerals, attempting to satisfy a hunger so profound it drives humans beyond sanity. When you look at the distribution of the final remains, the scientists can sometimes map out who was cared for until the very end and who succumbed first. And often, tragically, the smallest, lightest bones, those of the children, are the ones found scattered or showing signs of having been the first resources to be exhausted. They were the future, the reason for the journey, and the tragic irony of the ice is that they became the first to pay the ultimate price. Imagine yourself there. You have lost 40% of your body weight. Your muscles have atrophied so completely you can barely lift your own foot. You have been boiling water using the melted remnants of your grandmother's sled runners. The air is so cold that inhaling feels like swallowing glass. The howling wind that once scared you now sounds like muffled static because your hearing is going too. The world shrinks down to the space beneath your skin. You are no longer focused on the distant coast or the promise of land. You are focused on the immediate, agonizing demand for internal heat. And then comes the final, profound betrayal, the delusion of warmth. We see this frequently in fatal hypothermia cases. Just before the body gives up, the nervous system, completely confused by the cold, sends a massive, final, catastrophic signal. You are hot. This is why sometimes researchers find bodies that have paradoxically removed their clothing, their final, essential layer of protection, just moments before death. They felt a flash of overwhelming, burning heat. In their confused, starving, oxygen-deprived minds, they believed they had reached the end of the struggle. They believed they were safe. They believed the white nightmare was over. They start removing their furs, their boots. They expose their skin to the negative 40-degree air, convinced they are standing in a warm room, a field of grass, a safe harbor. They didn't lie down to freeze. They lay down because they felt comfortable, exhausted, and finally, miraculously, warm. This final, hallucinatory moment is the last cruelty the ice inflicted. It didn't just kill them, it convinced them in the span of perhaps 60 seconds that they had succeeded, that they had arrived. And we find them there, sometimes with their arms outstretched, stripped bare, lying exactly where they made that fatal, comforting mistake. They are frozen into the landscape, not just dead, but integrated into the very topography they failed to conquer. They stopped walking, not because they gave up hope, but because their bodies, in their final tragic moments of failure, convinced their minds that the destination had finally been reached. And that, tragically, is where the vast, silent collection of bones tells us the story ends. Except the story of what they left behind, the message etched into the very ice. That story is perhaps the most enduring part of this impossible tragedy. Except the story of what they left behind, the message etched into the very ice. That story is perhaps the most enduring part of this impossible tragedy. Because when we talk about the Arctic, or any great wilderness that swallows human ambition whole, we aren't just talking about a location. We are talking about a ledger. The ice keeps meticulous records. It takes what you give it, a family's final resting place, a misplaced artifact, a scrap of a diary, and it locks it down, preserving the evidence in a cold, eternal suspension. The land doesn't judge. It simply holds the truth for those patient enough to dig. And when the searchers finally arrived, decades later, they found that ledger open. What they found wasn't just a scattering of individual deaths. They found a pattern of collective, excruciating failure, written in the debris of the final march. We are not talking about a single shipwreck or a localized disaster. We are talking about a migration of ghosts, dozens, perhaps hundreds of men, women, and children, depending on which fatal route we are observing, all attempting the same impossible walk to salvation. Imagine this for a moment, sitting comfortably where you are. These weren't professional explorers at the peak of their health. These were victims, already weakened by years of substandard food, profound mental isolation, and the creeping, invisible terror of scurvy, that ancient mariner's disease that turns flesh spongy and hope sour. They were already dying before they took the first step away from the relative safety of their stranded ships or their last meager camp. The decision to abandon the ships, to leave the floating prison for the solid, deadly vastness of the white desert, was the ultimate roll of the dice. But the evidence, the heartbreaking material history recovered from scattered cache sites, shows us they were victims of far more than just bad luck and cold feet. Let's talk about the food, because the food is perhaps the most infuriating, tragic detail of all. Much of the provisions these migrating souls depended on, the tinned meats and vegetables meant to sustain them for years, had done the opposite. Academic consensus, confirmed by forensic science on the preserved remains and analysis of the cans themselves, points to a cruel, industrial sabotage. The lead solaring used to seal the tins was done sloppily, hastily, poisoning the contents. So, you have people struggling through waist-deep snow, pulling heavy sledges loaded with supplies, all while suffering from chronic lead poisoning. Lead does not simply make you sick, it destroys you slowly, insidiously. It causes delirium, severe digestive issues, crippling joint pain, and profound neurological damage. It doesn't just reduce your energy, it attacks your very capacity for rational thought, decision-making, and motivation. You were not walking north simply because you were tired. You were walking north with the heavy metal making every bone ache and every decision foggy. You were walking with a brain that was literally malfunctioning, courtesy of the very industry that promised to save you. This leads us to the darkest discovery etched into the ice: the evidence of desperation. When the last camps were examined, when the bones of the dead were analyzed, particularly those showing knife marks consistent with butchery, the historical truth became unavoidable. Starvation, combined with the debilitating effects of scurvy and lead poisoning, drove them to the final, horrifying recourse: cannibalism. Now, we need to be very clear about how history interprets this. This is not a moral failing. This is a scientific and human tragedy. They did not wake up one morning and decide to turn on one another. They were pushed by the absolute biological imperative of survival, stripped of all dignity and reason by months of agonizing hunger. When every fiber of your being is screaming for fuel and the land offers none, the line between life and death becomes blurred, and the definition of food dissolves. They became victims of a calculus so brutal that we, sitting here with hot coffee and central heating, can barely process it. They died hungry, sick, hallucinating, and profoundly alone, despite being surrounded by their comrades and loved ones. And the final message they left us, scattered across that silent, vast terrain. It is not a message of glorious failure or heroic sacrifice. It is a terrifying testament to human hubris. When we look back at the Victorian era, or any age defined by technological confidence and imperial reach, we see a tendency to believe that human will can conquer natural law. These explorers and those who sent them believed they were prepared. They believed their science, their training, their discipline, and their faith were strong enough to bend the planet to their will. The ice taught them a different lesson. The ice demonstrated its ultimate chilling indifference. You see, the Arctic doesn't care about your flag, your journals, your sophisticated technology, or your national pride. It doesn't acknowledge your heroism or your suffering. It only offers terms, adapt or perish. And when they finally failed to adapt, when the lead poisoned their minds and the scurvy dissolved their bodies, the land simply accepted them back into itself. That is the true enduring tragedy. Not the individual deaths, but the collective erasure of ambition. We return, finally, to the silent fields of bones, the final resting spots where they peeled off their clothes in that hallucination of comfort. The ice holds them there, fixed in the landscape. They remain, not as individuals. We barely know their names, only their suffering, but as monuments to a vast, shared, silent disaster. We tell this story, you and I, not to glorify the suffering, but because we must understand our own limits. We must acknowledge that the wilderness, even in the 21st century, still holds a power that can instantly strip away our modernity and reveal the raw, fragile human beneath. This story, in its cold clarity, reminds us that the line between civilization and oblivion is often just a thin layer of Gore-Tex or a properly soldered food tin. The vast, frozen silence remains, and the only thing left, walking that endless cruel path, are the echoes of those who mistook the journey for the destination and whose final, tragic migration ended exactly where it began, swallowed completely by the indifference of the earth. The story ends here, where the light fails and the silence begins its reign.